Now, dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this wonderful Sabbath, this time to fellowship together, and thank you so much that we do have a more sure word of prophecy. And I pray that as we take a look at your word, at some of the most significant prophetic topics and concepts pertaining to the times we're living in right now, and as we consider current events, that you would be with us, that you'd send your Holy Spirit to be present, and that our thoughts could be directed by heaven, and we'll have insights from heaven. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. 2 Peter 1:19 that we looked at for church. Of course, we have also a more sure word of prophecy. And no better time to be talking about that than right now. Isn't that true? Just amazing. These are fascinating times, aren't they? I know at lunch we were talking about developments happening in the political scene. And, you know, when we all heard that Ben Carson was going to be running for president, if you're like me, you probably thought, oh boy, Adventism is going to take a beating. But, you know, it's certainly gone better than I anticipated thus far, and we really need to pray. But did any of you hear the Glenn Beck interview with Pastor Bryant from the General Conference, which I thought was a very positive take on Adventism? There were some things that boy, it almost sounded like they might get into there in Revelation, but then the interview kind of pushed on. But as far as coming from the perspective of a Mormon who's used to getting beat up for his faith, he had a mind to try to be as positive and open as possible toward Adventism, and I appreciated that attitude. But there's been a lot of interesting things happening. I don't know if any of you, and I didn't do anything here to the projector, so I'm not sure why that's... I didn't do anything to the computer, so I'm not sure why the projector's doing that. Okay, you got it. But we were talking about this at lunch too, that in some respects Donald Trump has been instrumental in bringing more of a focus on Seventh-day Adventism. And I don't know if any of you saw the article written by an Adventist journalist, because you remember that Donald Trump said, well, Seventh-day Adventists I just don't know about. So someone wrote the article, I'm not remembering the title precisely, but it was to the effect that we can help enlighten Donald Trump on his ignorance of Adventism. Did you see that article? And it was, I thought, a pretty good article. So if you, of course, add to that the events that we all had been anticipating this year as we were moving closer and closer to September. So I want to take a few minutes to review a few things and to look at some of the developments leading up to that. And then I'm going to share something with you that perhaps it's a little bit risky because I have a little bit of a different take, my perspective on how things went in September. But I'm going to stick my neck out and I'm going to share that with you. So anyway, we're going to get to that. But certainly more true now than ever before that the deadly wound is healed and healing, and all the world is wandering after the beast, Revelation 13:3. I know you're familiar with this, but these are some excellent passages to put fresh in our mind again. The defenders of the papacy declare that the church has been maligned, and the Protestant world are inclined to accept this statement. Many urge that it is unjust to judge the church of today by the abominations and absurdities that marked her reign during the centuries of ignorance and darkness. They excuse her horrible cruelty as the result of barbarism of the times and plead that the influence of modern civilization has changed her sentiments. From Great Controversy, page 563. And that certainly seems to be the flavor that many people feel right now, because Pope Francis is giving them this different flavor. Another statement that I know is going to be review for most of you, but it's good to read it again. The Roman Church now presents a fair front to the world, covering with apologies her record of horrible cruelties. She has clothed herself in Christ-like garments, but she is unchanged. Every principle of the papacy that existed in past ages exists today. The doctrines devised in the darkest ages are still held. Let none deceive themselves that the papacy that Protestants are now so ready to honor is the same that ruled the world in the days of the Reformation, when men of God stood up at the peril of their lives to expose her iniquity. She possesses the same pride and arrogant assumption that lorded it over kings and princes and claimed the prerogatives of God. Her spirit is no less cruel and despotic now than when she crushed out human liberty and slew the saints of the Most High. The papacy is just what prophecy declared that she would be, the apostasy of the latter times, 2 Thessalonians 2, 3, and 4. It is a part of her policy to assume the character which will best accomplish her purpose. But beneath the variable appearance of the chameleon, she conceals the invariable venom of the serpent. From Great Controversy 571. Well, that's hard for some people to believe right now because of this guy, right? And you've seen this phrase before, the Pope Francis effect, which I think has really been one of the most significant developments, and it's not a sensational thing necessarily to talk about. But what is the Pope Francis effect? Well, I just typed in Pope Francis effect on Google and got a slew of pictures here that I did a little screen capture. And of course, all of us saw the video where he was calling for unity, and then the more recent video, which was interesting, where he was actually using the language from Revelation 13. Remember that? Amazing. About a wound that needs to be healed. Did you see this? Remarkable that this Pope is brilliant. And it's interesting to me, you know, it almost seems like if we look throughout history, the papacy can't help but identify themselves, so that there's really not a lot of question left. There's so many things that are just so obvious that you really have to not want to see it or just flat out be blind. And this was a perfect example of where, in a more recent video message, the Pope was appealing to the masses to think about this wound that needs to be healed. So he's not afraid to use this very language. And we've also seen now, over the course of the last year, some amazing things happen with Protestant religious leaders in America, right? Guys like Rick Warren, Joel Osteen, of course Kenneth Copeland, that goes back to that first video, and other American televangelists who all met together with the Pope, and this was reported now almost a year ago, under the title, Can Pope Francis Heal the Deep Division in Christianity? And referring to this big gathering, this large meeting, it says together they represented possibly 800 million Christians. Now that doesn't mean, you know, obviously these are religious leaders. They proposed signing on the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's 95 Thesis in 2017, a joint declaration of faith and unity for mission. The declaration will open a new era for Christians, encouraging them to act and pray together across the world in spite of their differences. These are amazing historical developments, aren't they?
2 years from today.
Yeah. Interesting. 2 years from today. And again in Revelation 13, where we read, He exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Revelation 13:12. I was really interested in what Joel Osteen had to say. I'm sure you're all familiar with Joel Osteen, right? Who's certainly one of the most influential evangelical leaders in our country. And here's a quote from him. I think the Pope is fantastic. You know, I just think his tone, his humility, I love when he said the other day, it's our view too. We're not trying to make this a little bitty narrow thing. Anybody's welcome. We may not agree 100% on doctrine and theology, but you know what? The Catholic Church, our church, it's open for everybody, so I like his tone. Rick Warren had this to say after meeting the Pope. Up close, you can feel the humanity and the compassion that others see from afar. As long as Catholics and Protestants love Jesus, we're all on the same team. So, you know, this is an amazing thing. I mean, if some Protestants of old would be resurrected and could hear these comments, they would just be shocked, wouldn't they? There has been a lot of talk about the Time magazine cover with Pope Francis, but in all honesty, I don't actually think that was the most significant publication event in his career so far, because other popes have been on the cover of Time magazine. He's not the first. The one that really marked it for me was this one, The Advocate. He was named, and I know it's been a while ago now, but I think this is really significant. He was named the Advocate's Person of the Year. And do you know what Advocate magazine is? That's the gay magazine. And this is an amazing thing for the gay community in their magazine to publish and name the Pope as the Person of the Year. Because you've got to realize that prior to this, the popes were all derided as being homophobes. And this is a remarkable shift, literally overnight, between popes to have the Pope become the Man of the Year. And of course it all came from this comment that he made, I think while he was crossing a tarmac to get on a plane or something. Somebody asked him a question about homosexuals, and he said, if someone is gay and seeks the Lord with goodwill, who am I to judge? And so here's what I read on advocate.com, the site for this gay magazine. His posing a simple question with very Christian roots when uttered in this context by this man, who am I to judge, became a signal to Catholics and the world that the new Pope is not like the old Pope. Now that little snippet right there, I think, is the most significant thing that Pope Francis has accomplished. And it's not super sensational. I realize that. A lot of people are looking for some inside amazing thing, but I got to tell you, this is the most significant thing right here. When the entire media, and I shouldn't say the entire media, but a bulk of the media actually comes to think that the new Pope is not like the old Pope, that there's been a major change in the Catholic Church, that's a huge development, and it's certainly worth noting. So these are just some thoughts I put down. The Pope Francis effect has created a perception that the papacy has changed. And this perception of a changed papacy, as I've said, in my opinion, is the single most important development brought about by Pope Francis, which obviously is setting the stage for the coming Sunday law. A few other things I wanted to just share here very quickly from Vatican Radio website, quoting Jim Ellen, who's an associate editor at the Boston Globe, specializing in the Vatican and the Catholic Church. He's accomplished far more than most of us could have reasonably expected, both in terms of style and substance. He's invigorated the Church at the grassroots level, but as Allen goes on to point out, Pope Francis has also notched up some more concrete achievements. He says these include the Pope's deep structural reforms, such as his most recent decision to create a new secretariat for the economy in the Vatican, to impose fiscal discipline. How's that sound? And as for the most surprising aspect of Pope Francis' papacy, Allen says that for him, as a longtime Vatican correspondent, it's the media's love affair with this Pope. So this is where I want to jump in and let me go ahead and read what he said. He describes the Pope's ability to win over the hearts and minds of the media as nothing short of astonishing. So this was recognized, quite some time back with Pope Francis, and I think it becomes important for us now in trying to ascertain what's really happening and what really happened in September. And by the way, this little side note I think is worth reading too. If there is an expectation that Pope Francis will radically change the doctrine of the Catholic Church, it is destined to be disappointed. In other words, there's not really a change, folks. There is no change. Notice this, again from the Great Controversy, page 580. Marvelous in her shrewdness and cunning as the Roman Church, she can read what is to be. She bides her time, seeing that the Protestant churches are paying her homage in their acceptance of the false Sabbath, and that they are preparing to enforce it by the very means which she herself employed in bygone days. Those who reject the light of truth will yet seek the aid of this self-styled infallible power to exalt an institution that originated with her. How readily she will come to the help of Protestants in this work, it is not difficult to conjecture. Who understands better than the papal leaders how to deal with those who are disobedient to the Church? Again, Great Controversy, page 580. The Protestants of the United States will be the foremost in stretching their hands across the gulf to grasp the hand of spiritualism. They will reach over the abyss to clasp hands with the Roman power. And under the influence of this threefold union, this country will follow in the steps of Rome in trampling on the rights of conscience. From 588, Great Controversy. Well, the stage is set, but what still needs to happen? And that's an important question to ask. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit here, because I want to talk to you about something that I've been concerned about, that I've seen happening in Adventist circles now for a number of years. And I'm going to run the risk in talking about this of being misunderstood. So I'm going to try to avoid that. But I recognize somebody might misunderstand me. I'm going to do my best not to be misunderstood. But I feel like this really needs to be addressed. Because Adventists seem to have an insatiable appetite for speculative predictions that relate to the fall of the year. Now, you know, the fall prophecy fulfillment is in our history, isn't it? And I find that kind of interesting. But for a number of years now, I've noticed, do I need to do something that's not quite... Oh, okay. Now I'm wired. Okay. For a number of years, well, let me take you back, because this is interesting to me. I grew up in the church, and so I haven't been around as long as some of you in this room, but I've been around long enough to see a pattern, and it concerns me. When I was about 15. I'm not going to name them because the point isn't to try to denigrate another ministry out there, but I mean that takes it back a little ways. When I was 15, there was a faith ministry that's a Seventh-day Adventist ministry, but not officially part of the church anyway, was traveling around, and the speaker was talking about inside information that he had that the economy was going to collapse in 6 months. Now, to me, I find this fascinating because there's a lot of things I can't remember that I heard in church when I was 15. Now, mind you, I wasn't maybe we should ask my parents. I don't think I was a rebellious teenager. I mean, I was in church. I grew up in a family that I'm grateful for the Christian family I grew up in. I'm grateful for my parents, Seventh-day Adventist believers. We were in a church that literally every year had an evangelistic crusade. For years. For a number of years, Lonnie Melashenko was our pastor, and he believed in evangelism, and he would bring in an evangelist to do a crusade every year in that church. And my family, my parents had us all there, 6 of us kids, in the front or the next to the front row right there every night of those meetings, and that's how I grew up. And I'm really grateful for that. You know, that does something to you because you just get immersed in it. And I'm not exaggerating when I say every year. There was a period of time it was every year, and my family did not miss a night. They wanted all of us kids to get it. So we would do this. So there are a lot of things I don't remember that I heard in church. I was a spiritually interested kid. But I remember that message. The economy's going to collapse. He had inside information. And the reason I'm telling you the story is because all these years later, I've never forgotten it. And one of the reasons I remembered it is because it didn't happen. Now, you know, I want to tread lightly here because we don't want to have our head in the sands, and we also don't want to assume that because something didn't happen doesn't mean that there were workings behind the scene to try to make it happen. I understand that. But I'm looking at this from the perspective of concern about a syndrome that I feel is within Adventism, that we are quick to jump on predictions, especially about the fall. So much so, I've been watching this now the last few years very closely, and sometimes the same emails from 2 or 3 years before are recycled. And people believe that it's the latest current thing, and it's actually from 2 or 3 years before. Now, I told you I feel like I'm being risky talking about this because, you know, I do not want to convey the idea that I don't think that there's an urgency of the times we're living in. I really do, and it's all the more reason why I'm concerned about this. Because I believe that what's happening and what's been happening is that in some cases it may be our young people. In other cases it may be onlookers. And when they see us get hyped up about something and then it doesn't happen, and that happens repeatedly, it is very, very difficult for people not to conclude that we have no idea what we're talking about. And that we are just, people who just sort of whatever ball is bouncing off the wall now, we'll just catch it. Now, what does this have to do with this September? Back in sometime during the summer, I started to receive emails because, of course, there's been a lot of anticipation about the fall, and particularly about September. And let's face it, there were a number of things going on, right? You got a historic development. There's no questioning that. Historical development. The papacy's come. The Pope is going to speak to Congress. That's a historic event. It really is. And not only that, but he's the Pope that the media has fallen in love with, as we just read. He's the Pope that has caused many people to think that the papacy has changed. He's the Pope that has, for the first time ever, been named as the Gay's Man of the Year in the magazine. There's a lot of significance to this. And there was the UN meeting scheduled, and there was the Family Council scheduled that weekend. Then there was also a military exercise happening here in the United States that many of you probably heard about, called Jade Helm. Just so happens, Jade Helm was concluding in September. And so there's sort of another checkbox for some very interesting things going on. And how can we help but notice that in the midst of all of this very significant activity, Seventh-day Adventism is being brought to the forefront because we have a church member who's running for president. I read an article this week that was very interesting, and it was asking the question, is Carson the first person with Adventist roots to run for president? Now, I haven't done further research on this, so I'm just going to throw this out there. This is from one journalist's point of view and from the research that they claim they did. But supposedly, President Obama has Adventist roots. Did you know that? That what they were claiming is that he has some Adventist relatives and he has some Muslim connections, and that the media basically ignored the Adventist connections and just honed in on the Muslim connections, and so not too many people have heard about that. But I find that interesting. But the article also said that Warren Harding, who goes back to late 1920s, right? Actually had Adventist connections, and that there were Adventists who were placed in significant positions in our nation's capital when he became president, that he never actually himself claimed to be an Adventist, and the church doesn't necessarily corroborate that he ever was. But I think that his sisters were, I think his mother was. And what's interesting is this is all coming out in the media. All of this talk about Adventists, Seventh-day Adventist beliefs, all at the same time. I mean, isn't that interesting? So, of course, in my neck of the woods, because I talk a lot about country living and getting out of the city, there was a flurry of, I don't even know if it's fair to tone it down as much as just to say interest, fervor, because some of you might have also seen, and I'll go ahead and name him, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with the name Lindsey Williams, who is a Baptist minister who's been producing videos now for a number of years. He's been making a number of predictions over the years. I think he probably came into prominence several years ago when he made some predictions about the price of oil, which came true. And so I think that really sort of put him on the map. And I think that would have been back in 2008 or 9. I want to say the summer of 2008, maybe it was 2009. Anyway, he predicted where the price of oil would go. He said he was getting his information from elite insiders, and it happened with the price of oil. So Lindsey Williams is on the map. Well, naturally, I I don't have my head in the sand. I started to kind of watch things, but I also started to notice that not everything that Lindsey Williams said the elite were telling him was happening. The elite told him that John McCain was going to be the president. Did you know that? But you probably know that he also produced a video, and I think it was early this year. And I think the title of it, at least you can find it on YouTube by typing this in. What you must do by September 15. Did any of you get a link to this video? What you must do to September 15. A lot of Seventh Adventists were watching this, sharing it around. And I watched most of the presentation eventually because I started to just, get feedback from people that were very, it's beyond concerned. They were in a rush. And one thing that's interesting about the whole country living and preparedness message is Mrs. White said it's important to do things in an orderly fashion and not be in a rush. And I've always tried to emphasize this with people, that the only people I've met who have regrets about this are people who did it in a rush. That you need to work systematically, and that my big concern isn't whether or not you're going to get out in time if you're working on it. My concern is the people who aren't even trying, who think that when the Sunday law passes, then they're going to make their move. And I think that's disastrous. But the people who are working on it, who are trying to follow God's counsel, I've tried to encourage them, don't be in a rush or chaotic about it, and make sure you do everything in order, and don't run ahead of the Lord, and don't drag too far behind Him, but just keep plodding along and asking Him to open the doors and move forward as you can. And as far as are you going to get out in time, leave that with the Lord. At least you're working on it. It's the people who are asleep that we really ought to be worried about. But because of concern, and eventually someone who even came to visit us who was clearly in a rush and potentially poised to make some mistakes, I decided I'm going to watch this Lindsey Williams thing. And it turns out that actually Lindsey Williams said if you didn't do this by September 1, that it was going to be too late. That's what the elites actually told him, but he was creating a little buffer by saying September 15. 2 weeks. I don't know. But, I really am, the purpose is not to in any way denigrate Lindsey Williams. The purpose is to talk about this repeating scenario that I feel like we need to be very mindful of. Well, of course, we've all been watching to see what is going to happen. There was speculation, I'm sure you heard it, I did, that the Pope is going to announce the Sunday law when he comes. There were many people who thought that he's going to announce it in September. There are people who thought that, well, with Jade Helm ending September 15, that tells me that maybe something's going to happen, and that will help to usher it in. The Pope will be right here to facilitate that. And I recognize tomorrow is November 1. So we're not that far out. I also recognize that we don't know what all is happening behind the scenes. But I really believe that if Seventh-day Adventists would go back to the basics and think about what needs to happen for the Sunday law to come to pass, that we wouldn't be so quick to fall into what I'm going to call hype and speculative predictions. Before we go there and look at these things, and I'm sharing this, I told you this morning, I'm sharing with you today things that I felt like I needed. And I'm going to share with you some keys that help me. Because I don't believe in having our head in the sand, but I do believe that we ought to be wise as serpents, that we ought to be able to, when stuff comes in, whether it's from the internet or wherever else, we ought to be able to filter it. And I believe that we have a more sure word of prophecy, and we should be able to apply some tests to things to say, okay, where does this fall? Is this something we should run with? Is this something we should hold out? And we should watch? Well, now let's back up the clock a little bit. Prior to September, our neighbor was having a wedding, which is not necessarily something I'd talk about, except it had one interesting, significant little point. We only have one neighbor. We're out in the sticks, surrounded by national forest, and there's two of us who own land out there. And he's been there for a long time, and he's a great neighbor. Talking one day about this wedding, he told me that his mother, and his son was getting married, by the way, on their property. His mother was very upset about the wedding because she's a devout Catholic. And she felt like it should be done by a priest in a Catholic church. So I made a mental note of that. Well, the weekend rolled around. I think it was ASI, was down in Spokane. And I really felt like I needed to go to the wedding was on that day. It was on a Sabbath afternoon. And I really felt like I should go. So I stayed home. The girls went to Spokane. I stayed home and I went to the wedding. And of course, I was very interested to meet Grandma. Right? I mean, that was certainly going to be a highlight of the afternoon, I knew. But actually the wedding was an awesome, it was one of the most spiritual weddings I've ever seen. I won't go off into that, but you know, I was going thinking I'm going to be in a very uncomfortable environment on the Sabbath afternoon. It actually ended up being a very spiritual, very a fine wedding. And then I thought, I don't want to stay for the reception because what am I going to eat? But they had vegetarian options. They had a kind of a taco bar thing. So I stayed there and had my eye out for Grandma. And I met her. And I thought, boy, I sure would like to talk to her because I know she's a devout Catholic. And I'm just always interested in, when I have a chance to talk to Catholics, I'm always interested to sort of get their feel. Find out, you know, what are these people... I know what I think. What's their take? Well, I introduced myself as the neighbor, and that was all she needed. She launched in. She launched in about how upset she was about this wedding, that it wasn't a true Catholic wedding. It wasn't happening in a Catholic church with a Catholic priest. And anyway, I could see she's pretty hardcore. And I said, what do you think about Pope Francis? She said, he's not the Pope. I said, pardon me? She said, Pope Francis isn't the Pope. She didn't say Pope. She said, he's not the Pope. I said, what do you mean? She said, we haven't had a Pope since 1958. I said, how many people are there like you in the Catholic Church? She said, a lot. I said, well, where do you go to church? She kind of sounded like a historic Adventist, but a Catholic version. She said, we have to choose our churches very carefully. We can only go to churches that have priests that are trained at, and she named the place where they had to be trained at. And she said, you know, she referred to herself as a Trentarian, at reference to the Council of Trent. And her belief was that Vatican II marked the apostasy of Catholic leadership. And had absolutely no respect for this Pope. Well, I was really taken aback. I thought, well, this is a whole dimension of something happening within Catholicism that I'd like to learn more about. Because a few years ago, I was on a plane and ended up, how does this happen? Sitting smack dab next to this Catholic guy. And we're talking about a number of things, and I started asking him what he thought about the Pope. And he said, you know, we American Catholics don't have those old views about the infallibility of the Pope and all of that. I said, really? Well, naturally, the week that the Pope was here, I was trying to kind of keep my ear to the ground, right? I mean, I wasn't like trying to tune into the broadcasts and all that, and there were plenty of them to tune into if you wanted to. I was trying to read the speeches in the evening and sort of keep track of what was going on. But I had to run to town to get a tool. We were doing a little project, and I needed to rent a tool, and it was the morning of Pope Francis' speech to Congress. And I was driving around 9:30, and so if you're listening to 590 in Spokane, you know who's on. Rush. By the way, if you want to hear one of the most impressive monologues dissecting the problem with Pope Francis that I've ever heard. It's Rush's monologue from the broadcast on that day. Fascinating. I won't take the time. I mean, it's almost good enough to just play it right here, but I won't do that. You can look it up on your own time. But I'll tell you, it was impressive. Rush influences a lot of people. He represents a lot of people, but he influences a lot of people. While I was listening, he finished his monologue, which was just, I mean, I've said enough about it. It was a fine, articulated statement. And he started taking calls. And a lady calls in, and she said, she framed herself as a devout Catholic person, and she said that she viewed Francis as a wolf in shepherd's clothing. And so Rush said, how many Catholics think like you do? And she said, a lot, but they're not willing to open their mouth like me. And I'm just taking note, right? I'm just kind of taking this in. Later that day, after I got back, I was doing something else. It's the middle of the afternoon, 3:30. Well, you know who's on 590 at 3:30 in the afternoon? That's Glenn Beck. And I'm listening to their conversation, again, influencing millions of people, talking about, you know, how, and yeah, he's Mormon. And they were even, one of his sidekicks even said, you know, I'm glad I'm Mormon. I don't even have to pay attention to this guy. Listen, far from being afraid of negatively influencing part of their, or alienating part of their audience, these people were vocal. I'm sure you know there was a lot of pushback politically because the Pope, interestingly, chose to make his sort of pivotal issue the environmental issue, which caused an incredible pushback politically. So, what's the point of all of this? At the end of that week, I was visiting some friends in an Adventist home, and I decided to really stick my, well, you know, I wasn't going to jump into the fray immediately, but there was a conversation going, and someone was expressing how powerful the Pope had been that week and how they virtually swept everyone off their feet. And then the hostess of the home turned to me and said, what do you think? And I was sort of hoping that she wasn't going to ask me. But I decided, well, I'm going to say it like I see it. And I said, well, actually, I saw a lot of pushback this week. I didn't see a wholesale jumping on board with the Pope. There was, to the contrary, a lot of resistance and a lot of negativity. And it was interesting because then ensued, the initial reaction I got in an Adventist home on Sabbath afternoon was, which I'm not terribly surprised, I think the person felt like, what, are you abandoning our prophetic position? And I explained, I believe our prophetic position. But the fact that I believe what's predicted is going to happen doesn't mean I'm forced into saying that it has to happen this week or next week. And now there are some who are saying, well, it's going to be by December, which interestingly enough is what Lindsey Williams eventually said. Well, it could happen as late as December. But you sense my concern that we keep a repeating pattern. And I really believe that it's because of a failure to distinguish that which is solid and that which is speculative. And that which is, we can honestly say is prophetic, and that which falls in another category out there where we're watching. We're not sure how this is all going to play out. And so I told you I was going to stick my neck out, and I'll tell you what my take is right now, and it's right now. Maybe with more information, maybe it'll change. But right now, here's what it looks like to me. What it looks like to me is that the media is in love with Pope Francis. Because Pope Francis just continually feeds them liberal fodder to pass on through their channels. And they love it. And for sure, the media is just falling all over him. Now, I'm not so naive to think that there isn't also a lot of support in the populace for Pope Francis. Of course there is. In fact, someone even called in on Rush's show to defend the Pope, to try to help Rush understand what the Pope really meant. And of course, as only Rush can say, he said, I don't need you to explain to me what the Pope meant. I know what the Pope meant. So it was an interesting interchange. But of course I realize there are plenty of people that are enamored with him. But what we need to understand is we are not there right now. We are not where people thought we were going to be in September right now. And I think it's healthy for us to just understand that and to say it and ask ourselves, what needs to happen for us to be there? Because I don't want to see us continue this syndrome of jumping on it, shooting out the emails, and finding ourselves again and again and again. You know what really concerns me is, I mean, with the exception of one person in the last several years, I've never gotten a single apology email from someone who has spread predictions, speculative predictions, when they didn't happen. Not a single one, well, except for one. Except for one this year, and if you're on the email list, you know what it was. A physician who apologized. He mailed out his whole list and he said, I apologize. I thought I was right. I was wrong. It didn't happen. He had some predictions that were supposed to happen in the spring. And bless his heart, you know, he did the right thing. But over the years, I don't see it. I see the same people who sent the one that didn't happen last year are just waiting to send the next one that's going to come in June and July and whatever. So, could the situation change rapidly? Yes. Could we be there rapidly? Absolutely. So what needs to happen? So if I were to put it in a graphic form, we're here. The length of this arrow means nothing. I mean, you know, it could be short, it could be long. I don't care about that. The point is, what needs to happen? So I'm going to go back and review some points that are in a chart. And I'm telling you, this chart has been helpful for me. This chart actually I put together out of my concern about what I've been seeing happen, particularly since 2008. Because 2008, a lot of people thought the Sunday law was going to pass in the fall because there was an economic collapse predicted for the fall. And so people just assumed if there's going to be an economic collapse, that means there has to be a Sunday law because, what was the reasoning? Because economic collapse is synonymous with national ruin. Economic collapse is not synonymous with national ruin. We've had other economic collapses before. It's not the same thing as national ruin, but that was it was a faulty connection. And so people thought that, and people were excited. I'm seriously, I mean like their heart was there. They weren't like just in a frenzy or fear. They were like, praise the Lord, this is coming to an end. It's going to happen in the fall. You know, they were happy. It was, you know, these almost create like little mini disappointments for some people. So what I want to do is, I'm going to go through these because this chart really I started to put together as a result of what are the waymarks, what are the things that will help us to filter, because it's going to keep coming in. And the problem is some of it's true and some of it's not true, right? And the truth of it is we're not even sure which of it is true and not true right now in some cases. We don't know. I don't know. So how can I mean, some things we know, some we don't. But how can I filter this out? So what I want to do is look at this particularly, because we'll probably be limited for time. I want to look at this first section because this is really where my focus is right now on this National Sunday Law issue and what brings that. The last great conflict between truth and error is but the final struggle of the long-standing controversy concerning the law of God. Upon this battle, we are now entering. Great Controversy 582. By the way, before I go further, I want to say this, in case I forget to say this. Because the jury's a little bit out as far as what's exactly happening right now. But it's not out on this one thing. What does it tell me when I see devout Catholics who are bucking the Pope, who are saying, this guy's a wolf in shepherd's clothing, man. And when I see people who are saying, this isn't the Pope. We haven't had a Pope in a long time. What does this really mean? What does it mean when Pope Francis comes? He has, and look at this, just to throw in another little weird curveball. Didn't you think it was odd that the very next day, John Boehner steps down? Man of influence, person of influence, Catholic of influence, just removes himself from the situation. So, what's my take? Here's my take. We are right now living in one of the most amazing opportunities for our message that we have seen in years because of the relationship of all of these developments. You have historic inroads being made by the papacy. You have the media lapping it up and publicizing everything the Pope does. You have Adventism coming into the forefront because we have a man running for president. And a lot of people are finding out. A lot of people didn't even know of what Seventh. For many people haven't even heard of Seventh-day Adventists, let alone have a bad vibe. But they don't even know they're there. But they're finding out now. All of this is happening. And what's amazing is you've got a whole bunch of Catholics that aren't buying it, and they think Francis is a loose cannon and a dangerous guy who's not really led by God. Do you see? This is opportunity, people. This is like opportunity for our message. To me, that's the takeaway. The takeaway is we're not at the end of that little line chart I had right now, and quite frankly, it's probably a good thing. I feel like a lot of our people aren't ready. But I feel like a lot of other people are ready to hear our message, and it's time to give it to them. It's time to share it when we have those opportunities with people who are open. Okay, so let's jump in here. The last great conflict between truth and error is but the final struggle of the long-standing controversy concerning the law of God. Upon this battle that we're now entering, and this is from the chapter called Impending Conflict, and that's why I call this section the Impending Conflict. We're in here somewhere. I used to have a date here, but I thought that makes people think that I'm putting dates on it, and I'm not trying to do that. This is more of a what needs to happen to get us from today to there. So let's take a look. Revelation 18:10, standing afar off for the fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. Revelation 18:10. Now notice this. Let all who would understand the meaning of these things, what we just read, about the fall of Babylon, read the 11th chapter of Revelation. Read every verse and learn the things that are yet to take place in the cities. Wait a minute. We understand that there's a symbolic meaning for Revelation 18. Do you see what Mrs. White just did? She put a literal application on it to the cities. Do you see that? Let all who would understand the meaning of these things read the 11th chapter of Revelation, read every verse, and notice down here she also says the 18th chapter. I didn't get there yet, but read every verse and learn the things that are yet to take place in the cities. She's saying that the things, what happened in Revelation 11? That's the French Revolution, right? And the cities are what? Sodom and Egypt, remember? Kind of interesting, huh? Egypt's a country, but they're referred to as the cities of Sodom and Egypt, and these things that happen there. And she says, this will help you to know what's going to happen in the cities. She takes literal. You know, this is sort of getting a little bit deeper, but I did an interesting experiment a few years ago. I was interviewing a bunch of Adventist pastors, and I asked them, is the out of the cities message in the Bible? And it was amazing. Not all Adventist pastors will say yes. I'm talking about even conservative pastors who believe the out of the cities message. They'll say, well, not really. I say yes for a number of reasons, but anyway, here is sort of an important application, and Ellen White helps to shed light on this. There is a literal sense of which we should understand Revelation 11, Revelation 18, when it's talking about Babylon, that applies to what's going to happen in the cities of our day, and that should be taken literally. And it doesn't take away from the symbolic meaning of Revelation 18. So read also the scenes portrayed in the 18th chapter of the same book. And so, in Great Controversy, she sort of drills down a little bit and gets more specific. He, she's talking about Satan, will bring disease and disaster until populous cities are reduced to ruin and desolation. From page 589, Great Controversy. So, we got an increase in disaster and disease. This is an important development. Because, you know, what's it going to take to unite those devout Catholics who are holding out? A friend called me. I almost thought I would grab these quotes for you, but you can look it up. A friend of mine, all of this has caused him to go back and reread Keys of This Blood by Malachi Martin. And it's very interesting. I think, let's say 634. Boy, I'll get the page from him. And if you're interested, email me, and I'll give you the page number. Years ago, Malachi Martin said that it will take an event, a huge event. He didn't go into great detail about what kind of event it would have to be, but it would take a huge event to pull off the ultimate rise to prominence of the Pope. That was from his perspective, which I think is so fascinating. So, an increase in disaster and disease. She went on to say this: storm and tempest, war and bloodshed. So, here you've got two kinds of disasters, right? Natural and man-made. In these things he delights, and thus he gathers in his harvest, and so completely will men be deceived by him that they will declare that these calamities are the result of the desecration of the first day of the week. You see where this is going? These are the significant developments that help us recognize the timing. From the pulpits of the popular churches will be heard the statement that the world is being punished because Sunday is not honored as it should be, and it will require no great stretch of imagination for men to believe this. They're guided by the enemy, and therefore they reach conclusions which are entirely false. From Review and Herald, September 17, 1901. And this one. Men in responsible positions will not only ignore and despise the Sabbath themselves, but from the sacred desk will urge upon the people the observance of the first day of the week, pleading tradition and custom in behalf of this man-made institution. They will point to calamities on land and sea, to the storms of wind, the floods, the earthquakes, the destruction by fire, as judgments indicating God's displeasure because Sunday is not sacredly observed. Christian Service, page 155. And notice this one, Last Day Events, page 129. Satan puts his interpretation upon events, and they think, as he would have them, that the calamities which fill the land are a result of Sunday breaking. Thinking to appease the wrath of God, these influential men make laws enforcing Sunday observance. So clearly, what happens is that increase in disaster and disease focused where? On the cities, on the metropolitan areas, leads to the question of enforcement of Sunday observance. And that, to me, just helps me filter out so many things. When people say, this is going to cause the Sunday law, this is going to bring the Sunday law, it's very simple. You know, for instance, in the fall of 2008, and you didn't have to have the gift of prophecy to know that the economy was going to collapse in the fall of 2008. You know that, right? I mean, Morgan Stanley said it was going to happen in June. We were doing a little independent documentary some of you might have seen called America's Cities. We were in New York City, and we were, ironically, we were staying with a young couple. She worked for Morgan Stanley. She was a secretary, like an executive secretary. But we were making trips to D.C., a couple trips, because we had an interview scheduled with Ron Paul. This is kind of an interesting story, I think. So this is like the middle of June 2008. And it would help you to know that Ron Paul had been running for president, remember? He pulled out, like, I think in May. But you might be interested in this story. I had been trying to get Ron Paul for an interview, and I couldn't get past his press secretary. Well, we had interviewed Roscoe Bartlett, you might know that name, a Seventh-day Adventist who's no longer serving. He lost in the last election, but he served, 8 terms or something. And I think he's in his 80s. But we had interviewed him, and so I was talking to my brother about how are we going to get past Ron Paul's press secretary. She's not wanting to let us schedule an interview. And I'm pretty determined, I don't take no for an answer. So my brother, who is helping us on the project, he's a kind of a movie guy in Southern California. He found out about our project, and he said, I'll help you do it. So he was our cinematographer, videographer. He said, well, Dave, you've heard about the law of 6 degrees of separation, right? And I said, no, what's that? And he said, the law of 6 degrees of separation says that no matter who it is in the world that you could think of, you're only 6 degrees separated from them. In other words, you know somebody who knows 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 them. Like 6 degrees. So he said the way that you get to that person is you tell everybody that you know that you want to talk to that person, and someone will know the someone who the chain will start happening and you'll connect. So I was talking. So sure enough, I started to talk to people about it, and somebody told me, well, you know, Roscoe Bartlett is personal friends with Ron Paul. Well, I thought, well, we already know him. So I called his press secretary, and I said, listen, I didn't want to give him the history about not being able to make this work, but I just said, we're trying to get an interview with Senator Paul, or Congressman Paul, and I heard that Roscoe Bartlett's a personal friend, you know, could you help us out? We had the interview scheduled in 2 hours. So it is who you know. But I also knew this. We just went behind the press secretary's back. And she was ultimately the one who had to schedule it. And I thought, she's going to pay me back. So, true to form, we had our time, and I told our little skeleton crew, my brother and a good friend of mine, some of you might know Mick Dunawin. You guys, you know Mick Dunawin probably, right, from Kettle Falls. He's my sound man. So I told him, we got to be there early, because I suspect that the press secretary scheduled this interview at a time where he's likely to be called away for a vote. And so we need to be early, because if we get there right on time, or whatever, we're late, we're going to lose our moment of opportunity. So we got there early. We walked in we were ushered into his office by the press secretary, a little short young gal, and she says, "Where do you want to shoot this?" And I said, "Where do they usually shoot interviews in this office? Because we don't have time to play around with lighting and everything. Where do they usually shoot interviews in?" Ron Paul is over in the corner working on doing something on the computer. And she said, "Oh, you know, whatever, where do you want to do it?" He spun around on that chair and he said, "That's not what they asked. They asked, where do they usually shoot interviews?" So right there, that kind of gave me a little insight. But I still thought, boy, I don't know, we might be in trouble on this one. So we set up quick. I would never set up that fast. Those guys were great under pressure. We started rolling. We got our interview going. And the press secretary had discussed with me our project. And I told her what our project was about. Things that are coming to the cities. And that we're doing this film. And she said, well, Congressman Paul is not going to tell people to get out of the cities. And I said, I don't need Congressman Paul to tell people that. I just want him to talk about what he normally talks about. Because he makes a good case. And I don't need him to say that. So we're not asking him to say anything that he doesn't say anyway. So I'm sitting here. He's sitting there. Right next to him, within kicking distance, is this little press secretary. And so we start. And sure enough, at the bottom of the hour, he was going to have to go vote. It was one of those times. She knew what she was doing. So I knew we were pressed for time. So about 20 minutes in, the interview was going really good. And I thought, what do I have to lose? There's a reason I'm telling you this story. What do I have to lose? I said, Congressman Paul, you painted all kinds of pictures about, you know, what happens in economic collapse and all of that. So you got people who live in the city. You got people who live in the country. I mean, is there an advantage? What do you think? And he didn't miss a beat. Here's exactly, this is the middle of June 2008. He said, the thing about June, July, August, September. He said, if I knew there was going to be an economic collapse in 3 months, that's how he started his answer. If I knew there was going to be an economic collapse in 3 months, I don't want to be in the city. And I want to be in the country. I was waiting for her to kick him, but he went on and he talked about the advantages of country living, and it was a great interview. In fact, there's part of the interview I'd like to put into something else sometime, because there was a lot about liberty, liberty of conscience, the Constitution, a lot of stuff that Ron Paul articulates really well. So the point of all this was that you didn't have to be a prophet to know that that was coming. The problem was that Adventists were confused about what's going to bring the Sunday law. They were thinking, well, yeah, economic collapse could bring it. No, no, no. It's disaster. Inspiration has told us. It's disaster and disease. It's entire cities being swept away. Now, is that going to have an economic aspect? Absolutely. Just imagine multiple cities being swept away. Imagine the economic impact of that. It's going to be devastating. But all by itself, this is not an economy thing. This is about something that's going to be so huge, unlike anything we've seen before, that it's going to bring people to their knees. It's going to cause people to say, we got to do something way different than we've ever done before. We need control. We need to get back to God. They're going to be ready when religious leaders say, here's the solution. So, quickly I want to go on and I want to talk about the Sunday law development a little bit. After these things I saw another angel come down from heaven having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. Revelation 18:1. It's been confidently declared that this land could never become other than what it has been, the defender of religious freedom. But as the question of enforcing Sunday observance is widely agitated, the event so long doubted and disbelieved is seen to be approaching, and the third message will produce an effect which it could not have had before. To me this is so significant because I've heard arguments about the latter rain and what is it that makes the third message effective, and you can't escape it. That its context, historical context, makes it effective. When people see happening right before their very eyes the fulfillment of these prophecies, it's going to have a power as it has never had before. It doesn't mean that we don't preach it before then. We do. But it takes on a whole new impact. So I'm going to just quickly fill this part of the chart. How many of you have seen this chart before? Because I'll give you a website where you can get this chart at the end, because I've got it so you can download it. You can get it in black and white if you want to print it or whatever. And the point, it's not, to me this is just a tool. It has nothing to do with times, or it's not tied to a time. It's more about a sequence of events and understanding what it is, how this develops. I'm going to push through the next part real quick because I want to get to that second segment. Actually, maybe I better back up. Where was the quote that I wanted to read to you?
Basically no time limit on the video.
Oh, there's no time limit? Okay. I was under the impression that we were have some constraints. Okay. So, this quote I have found pretty fascinating. We are in the shaking time. Present tense, right? And that was when? 1900. I mean, what does that do to your faith? There are some people that get shaken about that, talking about the shaking time. There's an interesting pattern that started to emerge for me when I started to lay these things out as I have on this chart, and I'll show you what it is here in a second. Evangelism, page 360. In the absence of the persecution, there have drifted into our ranks men who appear sound and their Christianity unquestionable, but who, if persecution should arise, would go out from us. Talking about the shaking. The time is not far distant when the test will come to every soul. The mark of the beast will be urged upon us. Those who have step by step yielded to worldly demands and, conformed to worldly customs, will not find it a hard matter to yield to the powers that be, rather than subject themselves to derision, insult, threatened imprisonment, and death. The contest is between the commandments of God and the commandments of men. In this time, the gold will be separated from the dross in the church. Last Day Events 173 and 174. So here's what I want you to start noticing. Is if the shaking was already starting way back when, and we know it's going to intensify, the fact that it was happening in 1900 doesn't mean that that's not true or that it's not happening now. It just means that that's when it started. In fact, this is a whole concept that I found some folks have a hard time with in prophecy in general. You know, the sweeping prophecies of Revelation 13, you can read them in a few lines, but they encompass years and sometimes decades, right?
Amen.
I mean, look, the development of the papacy, we're talking about hundreds of years, right? So you can read them in a few seconds. But the truth of the matter is, these are sweeping developments, and so much of prophecy is like that. When we're living in the middle of it, sometimes it's hard to appreciate that. We look for point in time. You know, like, this is it right now. Well, you're in the middle of it. I've run into this when I've had discussions with people about the abomination of desolation. Has that come? That's kind of tricky for people. I believe that it started. I believe we've seen the very first appearance or sign of the abomination of desolation, because the National Sunday Law is not only in the future. There was a push to pass that law in the past. Many people don't believe how significant that was. Mrs. White called the developments surrounding the National Reform Association and what's now called the Lord's Day Alliance. I'm talking about the Blair Bill, 1888, the end of 1888, hearings in Congress. In January of 1889, Mrs. White said, this is the fulfillment of prophecy. This is what we have talked about for 35 or 40 years. If you just look at 35 or 40 years, you'll see time and time she uses that time frame to refer to talking about the coming Sunday law. Isn't that interesting?
There was something going around right after the Pope was here about him standing in front of Congress was the abomination of desolation. I don't know if you got that or not.
I didn't get that. That's interesting.
I've got a question here, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
On this National Sunday Law, and I can't give you the page, but in great controversy, she says that somehow shortly after the National Sunday Law, national ruin will follow. Right. And I was just wondering if there's probably no way to determine a time frame. But
yeah, no, I haven't been able to figure out a time frame for that, if there is one. I mean, I haven't spent a lot of time trying to figure out a time frame either, but I haven't come across one. But so that's very interesting. I hadn't heard that about him standing in front of Congress being the abomination of desolation. But there's no doubt in my mind that the Blair Bill developments, Mrs. White said it's a fulfillment of prophecy. In fact, she said we should tell the whole world the meaning of those events. Yet, I mean, I have a friend who's an Adventist pastor who said he calls it the abortive Blair Bill. Just it's irrelevant. He dismisses it. It's like, wait a minute. It's a fulfillment of prophecy according to Mrs. White. And I think it's because people have lost sight of that they're getting caught unprepared now, and that they're not moving out of the city, getting out of harm's way before it comes in, and taking these steps of preparation because they think it's all still future. The whole point of bringing that up was that it's another illustration of something starting small and intensifying over time. That it's this process. Same thing here. Third message swells to a loud cry. This becomes a whole theme of end-time events. That it's not just a point in time, although we'd love that, wouldn't we? Because, I mean, I'd sure like to have a calendar and know exactly when it's going to happen. But nature doesn't work that way either. Have you noticed? Yeah. That's the hard part of gardening, isn't it? It's like on my schedule I'm going to harvest whenever, but nature says, no you're not, it's going to freeze. So you got to go out and pick them apples. I found that out when we had an apple orchard in Malo. There comes the right time, and it didn't matter if we had help or not. If we didn't pick the apples, they're going to get ruined. You let them freeze for a couple nights, they're nice and sweet, and then you got to go pick them. It's like you drop everything. Anyway, I've had people tell me that they didn't think deadlines were of the Lord. It's like, well, you haven't gardened. It's just the problem is the deadlines are not always what you want them to be, right? But that's an aside. So here you have these sweeping developments. Now, I'm going to skip this quote just because I don't think I need to belabor this here. But we're going to go into this second phase, which is the little time of trouble. And you're familiar with the little time of trouble versus the big time of trouble, right? So I'm not going to hammer all that out. And that's Mrs. White really delineates that very clearly. What I want to do is I want to look at the development of the Sunday law. Because here again, I think a lot of people are looking at this point in time event. It's going to be announced. It's going to be passed. Some believe that it'll all happen in secret until, boom, it's just announced. That's not what we're told. It's going to be a lot of discussion and a lot of debate. That doesn't mean that there isn't secret happenings behind the scenes to get us to that point. But it's not like one day somebody just comes out and announces the Sunday law. Thank you for the water. So, let's talk about the Sunday law. He causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. And that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Revelation 13, 16, and 17. Now notice, and now the reason I pointed out this whole idea of starting small, intensifying, is guess what? That's how the Sunday law comes about. As the movement for Sunday enforcement becomes more bold and decided, the law will be invoked against commandment keepers. They will be threatened with fines and imprisonment. Some will be offered positions of influence and other rewards and advantages as inducements to renounce their faith, from 607 in the Great Controversy. So do you see this same pattern now? It starts with fines, doesn't start with a death decree. In fact, in some cases even it's like, hey, let's negotiate this a little bit. What can we work out with you? Apparently those might be people who, have some connections and people like them. Notice this, in the last great conflict of the controversy with Satan, those who are loyal to God will see every earthly support cut off. Because they refuse to break His law in obedience to earthly powers, they will be forbidden to buy or sell. It will finally be decreed that they shall be put to death. So you see this progression? It starts kind of mild, if we could call it that. Fines, imprisonment. Doesn't sound mild, but it's sure a lot more mild than a boycott or a block from all transactions, and then a death decree. Now there's another way that this starts small and gets bigger, which I think is interesting. As America, the land of religious liberty, shall unite with the papacy, enforcing the conscience and compelling men to honor the false Sabbath, the people of every country on the globe will be led to follow her example. Now I think this is, if you believe what the Spirit of Prophecy says, this is very significant. Because was it about a year or so ago, with the work-free Sunday issue in Europe, there were many Adventists getting concerned that the Sunday law was going to happen there first. Remember that? What does inspiration tell us? It tells us it happens here first. That America leads the way. So you see how passing these speculations through a filter can be so helpful for us, so that we don't just jump on the bandwagon? And notice it says, compelling men to honor the false Sabbath. The people of every country on the globe will be led to follow her example. That's pretty clear. Again, foreign nations will follow the example of the United States. Though she leads out, yet the same crisis will come upon our people in all parts of the world. Testimonies for the Church, Volume 6, page 395. So, if I were to put this on the chart, it would look something like this. Increasing Sunday legislation. Inducements, fines, imprisonment, no buying or selling. Ultimately a death decree, but also it becomes international. It starts more localized geography and then spreads around the world. And it's during that time especially that having a garden is going to make a huge difference. Right? Because that's what this is talking about. Again and again, the Lord has instructed that our people are to take their families away from the cities into the country where they can raise their own provisions. For in the future, the problem of buying and selling will be a very serious one. We should now begin to heed the instruction given us over and over again. Get out of the cities into rural districts where the houses are not crowded closely together and where you'll be free from the interference of enemies. From Adventist Home, page 141. It reminds me of a conversation that I had with an old friend down in Las Vegas, who's still in Las Vegas. I pastored in Las Vegas. That was my first full-time assignment. I had friends that laughed when they heard I was going to Las Vegas. But they would always say, well, they must need pastors there. And it was an interesting experience being in Las Vegas. But I made friends with a fellow who, when he heard we were moving out, I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, yeah, 20 years ago, so-and-so, another friend of mine did that. He said, I don't know, I lost track of him. And then he almost immediately he said, well, I don't even know how to grow a garden. And of course my first thought was, well, why don't you ask that guy that moved out 20 years ago? He probably knows, right? The point is, it's a learning curve, isn't it? It sure has been, it sure is for us. I don't want to say has been. I mean, I feel like, we're scrambling to learn all the time. And finding out more and more what we don't know. But the best school is there, doing it. Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not, for there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, They will deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, Behold, he's in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he's in the secret chambers, believe it not. Matthew 24, 23 to 26. As the crowning act in the great drama of deception, Satan himself will personate Christ. The church has long professed to look to the Savior's advent as the consummation of her hopes. Now the great deceiver will make it appear that Christ has come. In different parts of the earth, Satan will manifest himself among men as a majestic being of dazzling brightness, resembling the description of the Son of God given by John in the Revelation. Revelation 1, 13 to 15. The glory that surrounds him is unsurpassed by anything that mortal eyes have yet beheld. The shout of triumph rings out upon the air. Christ has come. Christ has come. The people prostrate themselves in adoration before him while he lifts up his hands and pronounces a blessing upon them, as Christ blessed his disciples when he was upon the earth. His voice is soft and subdued, yet full of melody. In gentle, compassionate tones, he presents some of the same gracious heavenly truths which the Savior uttered. He heals the diseases of the people, and then in his assumed character of Christ, he claims to have changed the Sabbath to Sunday, and commands all to hallow the day which he has blessed. He declares that those who persist in keeping holy the seventh day are blaspheming his name by refusing to listen to his angels sent to them with light and truth. This is the strong, almost overmastering delusion from Great Controversy, page 624. So this is where we put the personation of Christ by Satan. Now some people, think it should go over there with the last plagues, which aren't shown on the chart, of course, yet. But, I'm interested if you have that position and why you think that's true. It makes more sense to me that it would happen prior to the close of probation, because I don't really understand what the point would be of a deception after the close of probation. So that makes more sense to me. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and maybe I better back up. I always get in trouble on this one. There's always people who take issue with me. And it's fine. I'm interested to hear your perspective. The point, this is not supposed to be like cut in stone. This is an ongoing project. So if you have an issue with this, I'd love to hear what your perspective is, okay? I can be corrected. It's fine. Won't be the first time I was wrong. Or the last. So, this next point, though, here's how it makes sense to me as I study this. The Lord has shown me clearly that the image of the beast will be formed before probation closes, for it is to be the great test for the people of God, by which their eternal destiny will be decided. Now, my conclusion from studying this is that probation closes for God's professed people before it closes for the rest of the world. But some people really take issue with me on that, and they don't think that there's grounds for that. I think this statement is part of the grounds for that, but I also think that this, 1 Peter 4:17, seems clear enough to me. For the time has come that judgment must begin at the house of God. And if it first begin at us, what shall the end be of them that obey not the gospel? So it makes sense to me that it comes in order. It also fits a pattern that we've seen of a process that happens that increases in scope and intensity over time. So I'm putting the close of probation for SDAs, and I'm not trying to pinpoint exactly where that goes here. There are some, Bible students who their issue is that they believe that when the Sunday law is passed, that is the close of probation for Seventh-day Adventists. There's quite a few Seventh-day Adventist prophecy students who believe that. I don't believe that. Now, one of the criticisms people have for me for not believing that is, well, so then you're opening the door for people to waffle and not have it seal their fate. Or they say this to me, well, how long will they have? How long would a person have after the Sunday law appears to make their final decision to pass the test? Well, maybe this is overly simplistic, but I just go back to school days. And when there was a test, the teacher passed out the test, right? Now, that's when the test came. We're told that the Sunday law is going to be the test. So when the teacher passed out the test, I didn't already have a grade on it, right? I mean, I had to take the test. So if that's the test, it doesn't make sense to me that you're handed the grade and the test at the same time. You've got to take the test. And then for the folks who say, well, then how long will you have? Well, however long is needed. I mean, the Lord can sort that out. I just know that when it was test time in my classes, one guy might finish in 25 minutes. He's done. Maybe he got an A, or maybe he had a brain freeze and got an F. I don't know. But he's done. He walked out. I was the guy that usually stayed the whole time because I'd answer all the questions, then I'd go back. You know what they say you're not supposed to do? I'd go back over them and ruminate over them, and then maybe change some right ones to a wrong one, or whatever. But that was that guy. So I'm taking the whole time. To me, I don't care how long it takes. But the point is, how is it fair for God to give you the grade for the test before you take the test? You got to take the test. So then that takes us to the final close of probation. At that time, shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Daniel 12:1. And I'm going to go ahead. I'm not going to read all of these quotes. But by the way, you can get not only the copies of this chart on our website, but you can hear a detailed presentation where I actually go through everything, all the quotes and all of that. And you can download all the quotes too. So sorry for those of you who your fingers are hurting because you've been taking notes. Yeah.
So you're saying, and I kind of believe like you believe.
Oh, great.
But well, it only makes sense. But during the little time of trouble, that we will, people who already believe will get a chance to really seal that deal at that time. But that also leaves people who have never really heard the truth. We will be making our decision at the same time they will be making their decisions.
Yeah, and some of them will be. Some of them will be behind us in the process, right? Because they're just going to be learning about it.
Yes,
and that's right. And
that will be their first time, but we will be sealing our belief.
That makes sense to me. Yeah.
It makes so much sense to me. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Albert could probably state this clearer than I can, but 2 weeks ago we were doing some studying, and if I have this right, correct me if I don't, that the judgment of the living does not begin until the Sunday law and goes forward from them, so it couldn't be ending in the Sunday law if that is the case.
Yeah, that makes sense to me because again, it's the test. It's qualified as being the final test. So I don't see how those decisions can be being made prior to that. It doesn't make sense to me. But this is one of those things where there's been a fair amount of heat sometimes in my email inbox over this point, but anyway. So then we come to the great time of trouble. And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God. Revelation 15:1. Now there is something pretty interesting here. Well, let's lay them out, and I want to show you something that for me was something that, as I was putting this chart together, came into clear focus, and I found it pretty fascinating. I saw that the 4 angels would hold the 4 winds until Jesus' work was done in the sanctuary, and then will come the 7 last plagues. Early Writings, page 36. When Christ ceases his intercession in the sanctuary, the unmingled wrath threatened against those who worship the beast and his image and receive his mark, Revelation 14:9 and 10, will be poured out. The plagues upon Egypt when God was about to deliver Israel were similar in character to those more terrible and extensive judgments which are to fall upon the world just before the final deliverance of God's people. Great Controversy 627 and 628. So this is where we put the 7 last plagues. Now there's something really interesting in here because it pertains to the death decree, and I want to show you this from Revelation 13:15. He had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. So there's the death decree. Now notice this, early writings 36 and 37. I saw that the 4 angels would hold the 4 winds until Jesus' work was done in the sanctuary. Then will come the 7 last plagues. We read this a moment ago, but we're going to see something here. These plagues enraged the wicked against the righteous. Notice, plagues plural. So, how many do you have to have? Minimum. You got a minimum 2 for plagues plural. These plagues enraged the wicked against the righteous. They thought that we had brought the judgments of God upon them, and that if they could rid the earth of us, the plagues would be stayed. A decree went forth to slay the saints, which caused them to cry day and night for deliverance. So you've got to have at least 2 plagues. And notice this. Says the Revelator in describing these terrific scourges, there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image. The sea became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea, and the rivers and the fountains of waters became blood. Terrible as these inflictions are, God's justice stands fully vindicated. The angel of God declares, Thou art righteous, O Lord, because Thou hast judged thus, for they have shed the blood of saints. Now, which plague are we on here? That's the 3rd plague. So watch this. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and Thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. Revelation 16:2-6. By condemning the people of God to death, they have as truly incurred the guilt of their blood as if it had been shed by their hands. So, if it's plagues plural that bring the death decree, and yet by the 3rd plague is actually almost an answer to the death decree, then that tells me that the death decree must come right there. So that is something more specific that it seems to me like inspiration brings out, which I think is interesting. So the decree will finally be issued against those who hallow the Sabbath of the 4th commandment, denouncing them as deserving of the severest punishment, and giving the people liberty after a certain time to put them to death. Romanism in the Old World and apostate Protestantism in the New will pursue a similar course toward those who honor all the divine precepts. The people of God will then be plunged into those scenes of affliction and distress described by the prophet as the time of Jacob's trouble. Thus saith the Lord, we have heard a voice of trembling, of fear, and not of peace. All faces are turned into paleness. Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. Jeremiah 30:5-7. Great Controversy 6:15 and 6:16. So that tells me that this time here is what's referred to as the time of Jacob's trouble. All right. As Satan accuses the people of God on account of their sins, the Lord permits him to try them to the uttermost. Their confidence in God, their faith and firmness will be severely tested. As they review the past, their hopes sink, for in their whole lives they can see little good. This is an interesting description of God's people, isn't it? They are fully conscious of their weakness and unworthiness. Satan endeavors to terrify them with the thought that their cases are hopeless, that the stain of their defilement will never be washed away. He hopes so to destroy their faith that they will yield to his temptations and turn from their allegiance to God. Though God's people will be surrounded by enemies who are bent upon their destruction, yet the anguish which they suffer is not a dread of persecution for the truth's sake. They fear that every sin has not been repented of, and that through some fault in themselves they will fail to realize the fulfillment of the Savior's promise. I will keep thee from the hour of temptation, which shall come upon all the earth. Revelation 3:10. If they could have the assurance of pardon, they would not shrink from torture and death. But should they prove unworthy and lose their lives because of their own defects of character, then God's holy name would be reproached. Great Controversy 6:18 and 6:19. That's quite a statement about the character development of these people, isn't it? That far more than being concerned about being persecuted or even dying, they're concerned that somehow they might bring reproach upon God's name. Well, I thought I had. Oh yeah. So here's what I'm going to do. You can visit our webpage, that's fine, but you can also email me. It's not like I'm going to get, 5,000 emails by giving you you can get my email address on the website anyway, but if you email me at Dave at backtoenoch.org. I'll send you a direct link for the chart. I'd like to do it that way because right now, if I give you the regular link that everybody goes through to get to the chart, what happens is there's an offer for our book there, and I'm just going to let you skip that. Okay? You can go through the back door. So send me an email. I'll give you the link, because I don't remember it for sure, to get straight to the page where you can download the chart if you're interested. You can download a PDF with all the quotes that you saw on the slides, and there were many there that we just passed over, we didn't read. And there's a full presentation on the entire chart point by point, which is more in depth than what we did today. It's broken down into, I think, four short videos. So I hope that you find that helpful. I know that for me, this information is extremely helpful because I don't want to keep repeating the fall hype situation that we've seen happen so many times. And again, let me clarify. Please understand, I'm not suggesting that everything that just happened in September is all hype. There is very real prophetic significance to many of these things that happen. But I'm also really interested in seeing people make a decision and commit for the long haul. And it's difficult to do that if we get caught in every next craze that comes along. I'm interested in, I'll be honest with you, if Jesus doesn't come in my lifetime, all the steps we're taking, all the preparations we're making are such a spiritual blessing that I'm glad we're doing it. I wouldn't want any other alternative. All of the steps that we're taking with our understanding of the prophetic scheme that we're in, and not understanding exactly how and to the detail and when it's going to start to really unravel. It's already started unraveling, but when the unraveling is really going to pick up. The way we're living now, I wouldn't trade it for anything. It's the very best preparation and the practical steps that we've ever taken for our lives spiritually. And what I mean by that is it's been hard. Can anybody relate to that? It's been hard. But I happen to believe that that's what we need. The Lord has given us kind of like a gentle boot camp to get ready. That's the way I see it. It doesn't always seem gentle to me. There's times when there's a lot of problems and a lot of challenges. And I'm coming off of a summer where it seemed like every problem that we had, and we've just been hit with one after another on a regular basis all summer long. And every one of them was a problem that was urgent. Have you ever had a period of time like that? It wasn't like something that, I'm going to read up on that. It was like, no, you got to fix it now because the girls aren't going to have any water. And when the girls don't have any water, they get unhappy. Right? But it's been such a blessing. It's been such a blessing for our family. The hardships have been a blessing. It used to bother me, it used to rankle me when I would hear critics' responses either directly to me or I'd hear them second or third hand. Because, we're really trying to urge people in the cities to get out. And the critics would say things like, people have done that and they threw in the towel, it was too hard. And that used to really rankle me. I used to try to come up with excuses. But I finally realized it's supposed to be hard. It's like, if you can't take the heat now, how are you going to take it when it really gets hot? Right? How are you going to take it when things really get hard? So this is actually a blessing. It's actually like a gentle preschool, kindergarten level of trial. Now maybe you don't feel that. Maybe you don't be offended. Because maybe yours is worse than that. But I look back, the worst stuff we've had, and I'm not even going to go into detail. We were talking recently. In fact, recently I was sharing some of my woes this summer on we have twice a month we have a coaching call with people that are trying to make this transition. And somebody got on the line and said, I don't know, the way you're talking, I'm not sure I want to do this thing. And so that made me think, well, maybe I better not tell all these stories. But you folks have been there. And that was an easy day. That's when I was just talking about the rats. We've had more pack rats this summer than I've ever had before, trying to get into our house. And built a nest. Toyota built a truck, and I bought that truck, and it's got a cavity like under the intake. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's like a perfect spot for a rat's nest. And it's, how do you get that out? I got to tell you, I mean, I was pretty angry with Toyota. Well, I was trying to figure out how to get that rat's nest out of my truck. Wow. Well, I'll tell you what I did. I got a little hanger and I got an air compressor, and it took me like 3 hours to get it out because it's all intertwined. Anyway, see, that's like nothing, right? But we had somebody on the call who like, rats? You got rats? And I was thinking, like, we got rats in the city. It's like, well, yeah, you got a point there. We got rats in the country too. But yeah, whatever they are. A couple of weeks ago, the third rat we've had this summer. I didn't know it was a rat. I was hoping it was a mouse. We started to smell it in Allison's closet. And had to be in the wall. So, I'm not going to go through the gory details. Let me just tell you this. When I first saw one of these little white worms, I thought, is that a wood-eating worm? And I started researching it, and that's when I learned what a maggot is. And when a maggot came out of the wall, I pulled the sheetrock off of the wall. Fortunately, it hadn't been taped because it was it was a closet. And that was rat number 3. Anyway, I'm not going to bore you. You guys you can tell me stories too, right? But you know what? I thank God for all of it. Yeah, even the rats. It's been a very, very good experience. And it's been a blessing to us as a family, just personally as a family, and it's been a blessing spiritually. And I think you'll understand this. Last fall, we just moved into this place. It's an old log home that's drafty, that needs chinking. I mean, it has chinking, but it needs more. There's places where they cut corners and they put a frame in and they didn't really insulate it right. So when you light a fire in the stove, you're just like, you're causing global warming, And so what happened was we moved in, we were only going to have a couple days, and I had winterized it. And I said to the girls, I said to Laura and Allison, it'd be really nice if we don't fill those pipes with water again, because we're going to be leaving in a couple days. And that was right about this time of year last year. Remember what happened? We had that deep freeze. And I said, we got a pond. We can get buckets for the toilets. See, you're groaning. I know now. I'm feeling bad about it now, but I asked them, and they're troopers. Yeah, we can do it. We can do it. Allison's like, yeah, it's 8 degrees, and if she didn't want to use the bucket from the pond, she went outside. And I'm thinking to myself, boy, I hope I don't make this so negative. She's 17. We had a terrible time. The house had been empty. And so if you've ever tried to heat a log home, which is already, is not great insulation. No matter what they tell you, it's not great insulation anyway. Wood. I went out to the shop 3 days ago. It was icy. It was icy everywhere except where the studs are. That tells you wood's not a great insulator, right? So it was hard to heat the house up. Downstairs, you could see your breath. So we finally, we got through that 2 days, didn't have to re-winterize, piled in the car. We're going an hour down the road. Allison looked at me and she said, Dad, I already miss it. And that just warmed my heart. I thought, you know what? Hearing that from a 17-year-old kid who could just be chomping at the bit because she'd rather be in the city, hey, it was all worth it. It's all worth it. So I say it's been a blessing. And I thank the good Lord for the blessing of our message, don't you? To give us light, to give us direction in this time, to be able to actually understand the solid points of what's really happening right now, right? We owe that to the pioneers who are willing to take a stand and hammer this out by the grace of God and pass that down to us. I'm so thankful for it. So I want to pray with you as we close today, because I know that everybody here, you're here because you want to be ready. You want to be in that group that is not going to be running for the caves, right? Finding the red books in the caves. Have you read that quote? There's people that are going to run into the caves and they're going to find red books in the caves. You know that? Isn't that cool? I mean, it's kind of cool. It's kind of uncool too, because at that point it's too late. I don't want to be in that group. So let's pray together. I invite you to kneel with me as we ask the Lord to help us. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for a more sure word of prophecy. And that we don't have any excuse to be bouncing off the walls with everything that comes along. You've given us enough to filter it. Give us the wisdom to be able to distinguish between that which is speculative and that which is solid that you've revealed in your Word, so that we can present that more sure word of prophecy, so the world will start to recognize it too as a more sure word of prophecy. People will see the truth. Thank you so much for the way that you've led us to where we are right now. Forgive us for our shortcomings. Forgive us of our failings. Cleanse us from our unrighteousness. Help us to trust in you, to make the decisions each day, throughout each day, to trust and obey, so that your power works its transformation on our hearts as we by faith obey your word. I pray for each family, each home represented here, that you'd bless and guide. I pray for this little church. What a great report we heard early today about the mailings that have been done, the Bible studies that are coming in, the people that are being reached from this little church right here. Thank you, Lord, so much for demonstrating your power when people are willing to just step up to the plate. By faith, say, yes, we'll stand up. We'll be counted for. We'll get a message out. I pray you bless each one of those connections. There's other people who've received that material, those little books. They're sitting on coffee tables and counters, and they're all over the place right now. Maybe some even ended up in the garbage, but maybe somebody's going to find it there. Wherever those little books are right now, we ask that your angels would attend to them. Remind the people to open them, to look at them and read them. I believe that hearts are going to be changed, that one day, perhaps in heaven, we'll be talking to somebody and they'll say, you know, it all started when I got a little book. We'll be able to look back and say, praise the Lord. So bless this outreach, I pray, this church, our homes, and indeed, again, help us by your grace to be faithful, that we might stand one day and say, lo, this is our God. We have waited for Him and He will save us. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you so much. It's been a privilege.